The crowd roars as the iron gates slowly creak open. A condemned man, clad only in a loincloth, trembles visibly as he steps into the blinding sunlight of the Colosseum's arena. The sand beneath his feet, already stained rusty brown from previous spectacles, will soon drink more. From the opposite end of the vast amphitheater, a different gate rises, and a hungry North African lion bounds forth, its eyes locking on the only prey available. In the imperial box, the emperor raises his hand, then drops it decisively. The spectacle begins. This scene, repeated thousands of times throughout Roman history, led the poet Juvenal to famously observe that the populace now craved only bread and circuses, panem et circenses, suggesting that public executions had evolved from solemn acts of justice into essential entertainment that kept the masses satisfied and distracted from political matters. For the Romans, punishment was never merely about justice. It was entertainment woven into the social fabric of their civilization. What modern sensibilities find horrifying, ancient Romans considered a civic duty to attend and a pleasure to witness. As the philosopher Seneca observed after reluctantly attending the gladiatorial games, "I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more voluptuous, and even more cruel and inhuman." Yet he still went, as did thousands of his fellow citizens, drawn by the intoxicating blend of justice, religious ritual, and theatrical bloodshed. Emperor Augustus himself established a system where specific days of the year were designated for public games, ludi, that included executions, with over 135 days annually devoted to such entertainments by the 4th century CE. During the inauguration of the Colosseum, Emperor Titus staged 100 consecutive days of games, including countless executions that were meticulously scheduled to maintain audience interest, lighter entertainments in the morning, executions at midday, and gladiatorial combat in the afternoon, creating a full day's entertainment built around death. Perhaps no form of lethal entertainment captured the Roman imagination more completely than damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Usually reserved for slaves, prisoners of war, and the worst criminals, this punishment transformed execution into spectacular theatre. The Colosseum, completed under Emperor Titus in 80 CE, provided the perfect venue for these deadly performances, with its capacity for 50,000 spectators and elaborate underground mechanisms for dramatically introducing animals into the arena. The Hypogeum, a 2-story subterranean network of tunnels and chambers beneath the Colosseum floor, contained 32 animal pens and 80 vertical shafts that allowed beasts and condemned prisoners to magically appear in the arena through trapdoors, creating theatrical entrances that heightened audience excitement. According to the historian Cassius Dio, during the Colosseum's inauguration, 9,000 animals were killed alongside countless condemned criminals in elaborately staged hunts and executions. These executions were often staged as mythological reenactments. A criminal might be dressed as Icarus before being torn apart by bears, or as Hercules before facing a lion without weapons. Emperor Nero particularly favored these theatrical executions, once forcing a condemned man to reenact the myth of Daedalus. According to the historian Suetonius, the man was fitted with makeshift wings and ordered to fly from a great height. Predictably, he plummeted to his death, splattering blood on the emperor's viewing box. In another instance, Nero had a condemned man play Orpheus, initially sending him into the arena with a lyre and the promise that his musical talents might soothe the wild beasts. For a brief moment, it seemed the animals might actually be calmed, before they tore him apart, creating a grotesque parody of the original myth, where Orpheus charmed beasts with his music. The Roman writer Martial praised such spectacles in verse. What was mere fable when performed on stage becomes reality in our arena. The scale of these animal executions could be staggering. When Emperor Trajan celebrated his Dacian victories in 107 CE, he commissioned games lasting 123 days, in which 11,000 animals were killed alongside thousands of condemned criminals and prisoners of war. The poet Martial commemorated these spectacles in his Book of Spectacles, describing how a female criminal, cast as the mythical Pasiphae who mated with a bull, was torn apart by a Caledonian bear. The crowd, far from being horrified, cheered such creative cruelty as the height of entertainment. Specialized hunters and trappers known as venatores traveled to the far reaches of the empire, from the dense forests of Germania to the deserts of Africa, to capture exotic animals specifically for these spectacles. A particularly elaborate execution under Emperor Probus in the 3rd century AD featured an artificial hill planted with real trees in the center of the Circus Maximus, populated with 100 ostriches, 100 stags, 100 boars, and countless other animals that were released to be hunted by condemned criminals who were promised freedom if they survived. Few did. Equally dramatic, but perhaps more terrifying, was vivicumburium, burning alive. This punishment carried religious significance for the Romans, who believed fire purified the pollution of certain crimes. Vestal virgins who broke their vows of chastity faced this fate, as did arsonists, in a form of poetic justice. But it was Emperor Nero who elevated burning executions to macabre performance art during his persecution of Christians following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. In a gruesome innovation, Nero's executioners would sometimes coat victims in wax or pitch to make them burn more slowly and brightly, extending their suffering while providing better illumination. Among the most famous victims of vivicumburium was the Vestal Virgin Cornelia, executed in 91 AD under Emperor Domitian despite her protestations of innocence. According to Pliny the Younger, she maintained her dignity even as she was led to the underground chamber where she would be entombed alive, the traditional punishment for Vestals, though some were burned instead, crying out to the emperor, "How can Caesar think me unchaste when he has conquered and triumphed under my ministrations?" Tacitus describes the scene of Nero's Christian executions in his annals. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. These human torches, as they came to be known, illuminated Nero's gardens while he drove his chariot among them, simultaneously playing the role of executioner, audience, and performer. The spectacle was so excessive that even many Romans, accustomed to brutal punishments, felt pity for the victims, not necessarily because they were innocent, Tacitus notes, but because they seemed to be dying to satisfy one man's cruelty, rather than for the public good. The site of these burnings, Nero's Gardens on Vatican Hill, ironically later became the location of St. Peter's Basilica, transforming a place of Christian martyrdom into Christianity's most sacred site after Constantine's conversion centuries later. This dual purpose of public execution, punishment and entertainment, extended beyond civilians to Rome's military, where fustuarium, clubbing to death, maintained discipline through theatrical brutality. This punishment typically awaited soldiers who abandoned their posts, lost their weapons, or showed cowardice in battle. The condemned soldier would be led before his assembled comrades, who would stone and beat him with their clubs, the fustes from which the punishment derived its name, until he died. The Roman military writer Vegetius noted that this punishment created such terror that the courage needed to face the enemy in battle became less daunting than the certainty of death at the hands of one's comrades. The fustuarium was so deeply integrated into Roman military culture that the historian Ammianus Marcellinus records soldiers voluntarily submitting to the punishment when they felt they had failed their comrades, choosing a ritualized honorable death over living with shame. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, described the procedure. The tribune takes a cudgel and lightly touches the condemned man with it, whereupon all the soldiers fall upon him with clubs and stones, and usually kill him in the camp itself. But even those who manage to escape are not saved thereby, for they are not allowed to return to their homes, and none of their family would dare to receive such a man in his house. The public nature of this punishment was crucial. It served as a deterrent, forcing soldiers to witness what awaited those who failed in their duty. During the Second Punic War, when Rome faced its greatest military crisis against Hannibal, the consul Titus Sempronius Gracchus ordered fustuarium for an entire cohort of 4,000 men who had fled from battle, though this was later commuted to decimation, execution of every 10th man, suggesting that even this brutal punishment had practical limitations when applied at scale. During the Third Servile War, 73-71 BC, after Marcus Licinius Crassus had crushed Spartacus's slave rebellion, he demonstrated the terrifying efficacy of fustuarium on a grand scale. Those rebels not sentenced to crucifixion faced public execution by clubs along the Appian Way. The message was clear. Rome's military might extend not just to external enemies, but to enforcing internal discipline through ritualized violence that served both punitive and entertainment purposes. The Roman general Pompey, known for his theatrical flair, once ordered that soldiers guilty of repeated theft be beaten to death before the assembled army, using not ordinary clubs, but the shafts of military standards, symbols of Roman honor turned into instruments of execution, heightening both the shame and spectacle of the punishment. Perhaps most visually spectacular of all Roman execution methods was pulveratio, crushing by stones, or more extravagantly, by elephants. This method held particular significance as it physically obliterated the condemned, leaving barely recognizable human remains. For crimes considered especially heinous, this total destruction of the body carried symbolic weight, denying the criminal proper burial and afterlife rites. The Roman jurist Aemilius Macer noted that crushing punishments were particularly appropriate for parricidae, killers of close relatives, as they return the criminal to the dust, leaving nothing for the family to mourn or the spirits to claim. In a particularly notorious case from the late Republic, a man convicted of murdering his father was sewn into a sack with a dog, rooster, monkey, and viper before being crushed under stones, combining two separate punishments to ensure both complete physical and spiritual destruction. While crushing under stones, sometimes slowly applied to prolong suffering, was more common due to practical constraints, elephant executions represented the height of exotic punishment as performance. After defeating Pyrrhus of Epirus in the 3rd century BC, Romans acquired war elephants and discovered their utility not just in battle, but as instruments of execution. Deserters and prisoners of war might be paraded into the arena, then crushed beneath the feet of trained elephants as crowds roared their approval. The naturalist Pliny the Elder described how elephants could be trained to kill with agonizing precision. They can be taught to walk ropes, to throw missiles, and even to kill on command, crushing a man limb by limb as directed by their handler. This controlled destruction allowed for executions to be prolonged for maximum entertainment value, a skill that elephant trainers, called elephant arches, cultivated to please their imperial patrons. The spectacle reached new heights during the Punic Wars, when captured Carthaginian generals faced death beneath the very war elephants they had once commanded against Rome. According to Valerius Maximus, some prisoners were even dressed in enemy armor, allowing the elephants, already trained to attack specific colors or emblems in battle, to enact a miniature recreation of Roman military victories while delivering justice. During Emperor Claudius's reign in the 1st century CE, these elephant executions were revived for special occasions, with condemned criminals forced to fight the beasts with minimal weapons before inevitably being crushed. The writer Aelian recorded that one such event went spectacularly wrong when an elephant refused to kill a condemned man who had once been its keeper, trumpeting in protest instead. The crowd, moved by this display of animal loyalty, demanded the man's pardon, which Claudius reluctantly granted, demonstrating how even execution as entertainment could sometimes yield unexpected moments of mercy. Roman attitudes toward these spectacular punishments evolved over centuries, reflecting broader social and political changes. Under the Republic, public executions emphasized the rule of law and consequences of disregarding the social order. As Rome transformed into an empire, emperors increasingly used these spectacles to demonstrate their power and generosity, providing ever more elaborate, entertainments to win public favor, while simultaneously displaying the terrible fate of those who challenged imperial authority. Emperor Commodus took this trend to narcissistic extremes, not only ordering elaborate executions, but personally participating in arena killings, styling himself as the demigod Hercules as he dispatched prisoners with club and sword. The historian Herodian records that Commodus once ordered all physically disabled persons in Rome to be gathered in the arena, where he clubbed them to death while disguised as the mythical figure, transforming punishment into personal theatre and blurring the line between justice and imperial amusement. Crushed, crucified, and cast away, Rome's most terrifying punishments for treason. In the shadow of Rome's glory lay its darkest punishments. The empire that built roads spanning continents and aqueducts defying gravity showed equal innovation in how it disciplined those who betrayed its trust. For Romans, betrayal was not merely a crime against individuals, but against the very fabric of Roman identity. Their punishments reflected this severity, designed not just to end lives, but to communicate powerful messages about loyalty, honor, and the consequences of treachery. As Cicero declared in his Philippics, a nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. When Consul Titus Quinctius Flamininus proclaimed freedom for all Greeks at the Isthmian Games in 196 BC, he embodied Rome's ideal of virtuous leadership. Yet the same civilization that celebrated such nobility developed elaborate mechanisms to punish those who betrayed Rome's trust. These punishments were theatrical, public, and designed to instill both fear and respect among witnesses. They served as visceral reminders that Roman power, while often benevolent, could manifest terrible wrath when betrayed. Emperor Augustus himself summed up this duality when he reportedly stated, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." Yet his reign also witnessed some of the most notorious treason trials in Roman history, including those of poet Ovid and his own daughter Julia. The punishment of traitors became increasingly sophisticated during the transition from republic to empire, with the historian Tacitus noting that betrayal of the state expanded to include even speaking ill of the emperor, a significant shift that reflected Rome's changing political landscape. The most infamous method of execution in Roman times was crucifixion, a punishment so brutal that Roman citizens were generally exempt from it. Reserved primarily for slaves, pirates, enemies of the state, and the worst criminals, crucifixion represented the ultimate humiliation. The condemned would be stripped of their clothing, flogged mercilessly, and forced to carry the horizontal beam of their cross, the patibulum, to the execution site. There, they would be affixed to the wood with nails or rope, and left to die slowly from exhaustion and asphyxiation, a process that could take days. The scene was so common that the Latin word for cross, crux, became a casual curse word, and the phrase abi in malam crutem, go to the bad cross, was a common insult, equivalent to telling someone to go to hell. Roman executioners developed specialized techniques to prolong suffering, including using sedile, small seats, on the cross that prevented victims from suffocating too quickly, thereby extending their torment from hours to days. The philosopher Seneca described the variety of crucifixions he witnessed. "I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with head down to the ground, some impale their private parts, others stretch out their arms." Following Spartacus's slave rebellion in 71 BC, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus demonstrated the empire's response to betrayal on a massive scale. After defeating Spartacus's army, he ordered approximately 6,000 captured rebels crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. This 200-kilometer stretch of road became a gallery of human suffering, a warning to any who might consider challenging Rome's authority. Travelers on this major thoroughfare would pass thousands of dying men, their suffering deliberately prolonged by Roman executioners skilled in keeping victims alive to maximize their torment. The message was unmistakable. This is what becomes of those who raise arms against Rome. Plutarch later recorded that the bodies remained until they rotted away, a grim reminder that persisted long after the victims had died. Julius Caesar, who witnessed these events as a young man, would later show similar ruthlessness when dealing with pirates who had once kidnapped him. After paying his ransom and securing his freedom, he returned with a fleet, captured them, and had them crucified, though he ordered their throats cut first as a small mercy, because they had treated him well during his captivity. While crucifixion targeted external enemies and lower classes, the Tarpeian Rock awaited Romans who betrayed their own. Named after Tarpeia, who allegedly betrayed Rome to the Sabines in exchange for what they wore on their arms, meaning their golden bracelets, though they crushed her with their shields instead. This execution site was a steep cliff on the southern summit of the Capitoline Hill. Standing approximately 25 meters high, it overlooked the Roman Forum, the heart of civic life. The site became so synonymous with punishment for treason that Juvenal would later write in his satires, "Yet who would label the crime madness? Who would confine you to Antisira's asylum when you could descend from the Tarpeian Rock?" Suggesting that betraying Rome was beyond insanity and deserved death rather than treatment. According to Roman tradition, the first person executed at the rock was not Tarpeia herself, who was buried beneath the shields of the Sabines, but Spurius Cassius Vesalianus, a consul accused of attempting to establish tyranny in 486 BC. His execution established a pattern that would continue for centuries. Ambitious politicians who overreached found themselves making the fatal plunge within sight of the power they had coveted. The symbolism was deliberate. Traitors would be cast out from the very center of Roman society, their bodies broken on the rocks below, where they might be denied proper burial. The historian Livy records that in 384 BC, Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, ironically, once a hero who had saved Rome from a Gallic attack, was executed at the Tarpeian Rock after being accused of aspiring to kingship. His crime was not just ambition, but betraying the republican values Rome held sacred. As he plunged to his death within sight of the temples and government buildings he'd once defended, Romans received a powerful reminder that no status or former glory could protect those who betrayed the state. Later, in 86 BC, the tribune Sextus Lucilius would meet the same fate, thrown from the rock by order of Gaius Marius during the civil wars that racked the late Republic, a political murder disguised as punishment for treason. The execution site remained active well into the imperial period. Archaeological evidence suggests that the area below the cliff accumulated so many human remains that it required periodic clearing. Emperor Claudius reportedly attended these executions personally, taking a perverse pleasure in examining the broken bodies afterward to observe how they had landed, which the philosopher Seneca criticized as unnecessarily cruel even for executions. For military units that failed in their duty, Rome devised an especially chilling punishment: decimation. The word itself derives from the Latin decimare, meaning to take a tenth. When a legion showed cowardice or mutinied, they might face this collective punishment. The process was methodical and designed to maximize psychological impact. Soldiers would be divided into groups of 10, and each group would draw lots. The unlucky soldier who drew the shortest lot would be beaten to death by his 9 comrades. The centurion Titus Pulio described it as a lesson written in blood that no soldier ever needed twice. Survivors of decimation were often forced to camp outside the protection of the main fortifications and subsist on barley instead of wheat, a further humiliation for professional soldiers. The military writer Frontinus noted that units that had been decimated often became Rome's fiercest fighters in subsequent battles, desperate to redeem themselves and eliminate the stigma of their punishment. One such legion, the Legio III Augusta, was decimated after poor performance in Numidia, but later became one of Rome's most decorated units under Emperor Septimius Severus, earning the nickname the Emperor's Cudgel for their ferocity in battle. This punishment served multiple purposes. It created a terrible lottery where every soldier had a 1 in 10 chance of death, generating fear across the entire unit. More insidiously, it forced soldiers to participate in executing their brothers in arms, making them complicit in the punishment. After witnessing, or participating in, such brutality, the surviving soldiers would likely never consider desertion or disobedience again. The poet Lucan later captured the terror of decimation in his epic Pharsalia, writing that chance became the arbiter of doom, and on the hazard of the lot depended death. The psychological impact was so severe that some soldiers reportedly chose to end their own lives, rather than participate in killing their comrades, while others formed blood bonds, pledging not to survive if one of them drew the fatal lot, attempts to preserve their sense of humanity within an inherently dehumanizing system. One of the most famous instances of decimation occurred in 71 BCE, the same year as Spartacus's defeat, when Marcus Licinius Crassus used it against his own troops. When a legion under Mummius was defeated by Spartacus, after engaging against orders, Crassus revived this ancient punishment, which had fallen out of common usage. 500 men died at the hands of their comrades, in a grim reminder that failure could be equated with betrayal. Centuries later, in 17 CE, the general Germanicus would threaten decimation to quell a mutiny on the Rhine frontier, though he ultimately chose more targeted punishments. When the mutineers themselves demanded the execution of the ringleaders, Germanicus allowed them to carry out the killings themselves, showing how the psychology of decimation could be adapted to new circumstances. Even as late as the crisis of the 3rd century, Emperor Gallienus threatened an entire legion with decimation for supporting a rival claimant to the throne, though he ultimately spared them after they proved their loyalty by defeating an enemy force while wearing only their tunics, leaving their armor behind as a display of courage. Perhaps most sophisticated of all Roman punishments was damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. For a culture that placed enormous value on remembrance and legacy, this punishment struck at something Romans feared more than death itself, oblivion. When the Senate decreed this punishment, it ordered the systematic erasure of the condemned from history. Statues would be destroyed or recarved with new faces. Names were chiseled from inscriptions. Wills were invalidated. Even mentioning the person's name could become illegal. The poet Horace captured the Roman obsession with memorial when he wrote, "Non omnis moriar, I shall not wholly die," in his odes, a statement of hope that his works would survive him, the very hope that damnatio memoriae sought to extinguish. The practice became so common during politically unstable periods that sculptors reportedly developed techniques for creating statues with removable heads, anticipating that the subject might eventually fall from favor and need to be replaced with a more politically acceptable figure. Emperor Domitian's memory suffered this fate after his assassination in 96 CE. The Senate ordered his statues destroyed or reworked. His name was scratched from public monuments. In some cases, entire buildings associated with him were demolished. His coins were melted down. Officials meticulously worked to remove all trace of his existence, as if he had never ruled Rome at all. The historian Suetonius noted that the Senate was overjoyed at Domitian's death and immediately set about erasing his legacy. Archaeological evidence of this erasure remains visible today. In the Roman Forum, inscriptions bearing Domitian's name show clear evidence of having been deliberately damaged or recarved. Similarly, Emperor Commodus, whose erratic behavior and megalomaniacal tendencies earned him the hatred of the Senate, suffered damnatio memoriae after his strangling in 192 CE, though his successor Septimius Severus later reversed this judgment and deified him instead, showing how even erasure could be impermanent in the shifting politics of imperial Rome. What makes damnatio memoriae particularly fascinating is its paradox. We know about these erased individuals precisely because the effort to remove them was so thorough that it became noteworthy. The very attempt to destroy memory preserved it in a different form. The conspicuous absence became a presence of its own, reminding Romans of the consequences of betrayal. Perhaps no case illustrates this better than that of Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect who nearly seized power under Emperor Tiberius in 31 CE. After his fall, his statues were torn down and melted, their metal used to create unflattering images of despised figures. His children were executed to prevent his bloodline from continuing. His young daughter, according to Tacitus, asked, "What have I done? Where are you taking me? I won't do it again," as she was led to her execution, not understanding that her very existence was considered a threat to Rome. Despite these thorough efforts at erasure, Sejanus's attempted coup became one of the most well-documented political crises of the early empire, preserved in detail by the very historians who recorded the attempt to eliminate his memory. As Rome evolved from republic to empire, these punishments remained, adapting to new political realities but maintaining their core purpose: to protect Rome from those who would betray her. The poet Virgil, in his epic Aeneid, described the punishment awaiting traitors in the underworld. Here those who hated their brothers while alive, who struck their parents, who defrauded their dependents, are imprisoned and await punishment. These mythological torments mirrored the very real punishments Rome inflicted on those it considered traitors. They remind us that behind Rome's magnificent architecture and sophisticated legal system lay a willingness to employ spectacular violence against those who threatened its stability or betrayed its trust. As Emperor Constantine reportedly declared after executing his son Crispus for suspected treason, "Better that Rome lose one citizen than its soul to betrayal. From the sack to the stake, the darkest justice of ancient Rome." The Romans who built the Pantheon and conceived the philosophical wisdom of Marcus Aurelius also devised some of history's most disturbing methods of human suffering. Roman torture was not merely punitive, but deeply symbolic, a calculated theater of pain that revealed much about their values, fears, and understanding of justice. While crucifixion and damnatio ad bestias remain their most famous execution methods, Rome's legal codes contained far more terrifying punishments, often designed not merely to kill, but to communicate complex messages about the crime and criminal. As the statesman Cassius Dio observed, in the administration of justice, the Romans believed the punishment should mirror the essence of the crime itself. This philosophy produced executions of such elaborate cruelty that even hardened soldiers sometimes turned away. The most symbolically rich of these punishments was poena culae, the punishment of the sack, reserved almost exclusively for those guilty of parricidium, the murder of a parent or close relative. The condemned would first be beaten with blood-colored rods, then sewn into a leather sack alongside live animals, typically a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a viper. This bizarre menagerie was not randomly chosen. Each animal represented an aspect of the criminal's transgression. The dog symbolized shamelessness, the cock arrogance, the monkey malice, and the snake venomous hatred. This macabre ensemble would then be thrown into the Tiber River or the sea. The punishment appeared in Rome's earliest known legal code, the 12 Tables, showing its ancient origins. One of the most notorious cases involved Publicius Malleolus, who murdered his mother in 101 BC and became the first officially recorded recipient of the poena culae under the Republic. Roman historian Livy notes that after the matricide, officials were initially unsure how to proceed, as the punishment had fallen into disuse, requiring research into ancestral customs before they could properly execute Malleolus. Emperor Claudius reportedly witnessed such an execution and was deeply moved by the symbolism. The ritual had ancient origins dating to Rome's earliest legal codes, but it fell into disuse during the late Republic until Emperor Augustus revived it as part of his moral reforms. For the Romans, the specific horror of parricidium lay in its betrayal of pietas, the sacred duty owed to one's parents and ancestors. By killing his father, the parricide had severed his connection to Roman society itself. Thus, his punishment removed him not only from human company, but from contact with the fundamental elements of creation, denied earth for burial, air to breathe, water to drink, and symbolically removed from the sun's light upon being sealed in the sack. During the 2nd century CE, the jurist Modestinus recorded a case where the condemned man laughed during the proceedings. When asked why, he responded, "I am laughing because today I will achieve what philosophers strive for their entire lives, to experience all elements at once. His clever response did not save him, and the execution proceeded as planned at the Cistercian Bridge, one of the traditional sites for this punishment. The prosecutor Cicero, arguing against Sextus Roscius on a charge of patricide, explained the punishment's logic. They want him to be unable to have sky, sun, water, or earth, so that he who killed the one who gave him life should be deprived of all those things from which all living things are said to derive their life. The poena culae created a striking contrast between the sacred bonds the criminal had broken and the new, perverse family he would join in death, trapped for eternity with beasts rather than the honored ancestors he had betrayed. The punishment evolved over time. In earlier periods, the sack contained only serpents, while the full menagerie developed during the Empire. Emperor Hadrian modified the punishment slightly for patricides who killed under mitigating circumstances, substituting drowning in the sea without animals. According to legal records preserved in Justinian's Digest, some localities without access to monkeys substituted different animals, such as wolves or bears, maintaining the symbolic framework while adapting to practical limitations. While the poena culae emerged from Roman religious and legal tradition, Scaphism, also known as the boats or the torture raft, represented a punishment the Romans adopted from the Persians but modified to their purposes. The condemned would be stripped of their garments and fastened between two boats, or hollow logs, with head, hands, and feet protruding. Force-fed milk and honey until developing severe diarrhea, the victim would then be left floating on a stagnant pond, their face covered with honey to attract insects. The name derives from the Greek scaphe, meaning anything scooped out, referring to the hollowed vessel containing the victim. Though primarily Persian in origin, Romans implemented this torture during the later imperial period, particularly in eastern provinces where Persian influence remained strong. General Macrinus, who briefly became emperor in 217 CE, was notorious for applying this punishment to corrupt provincial officials, stating they should experience the consequences of their own filth. Unable to move and covered in their own excrement, the condemned would be slowly consumed by insects while still alive. Death could take weeks, with the victim suffering through putrefaction before finally expiring. The Roman historian Plutarch described the execution of the soldier Mithridates by this method, noting he survived an astonishing 17 days before death mercifully claimed him. While less commonly employed than other methods, scaphism was occasionally used for those who committed sacrileges against Roman religious sites or betrayed military secrets to enemies, crimes considered to place the entire community at risk. During Emperor Valerian's persecution of Christians in the mid-3 RD century CE, the Deacon Sanctus of Carthage reportedly endured a modified version of this torture, with hot plates applied to his honey-covered body, attracting insects while simultaneously burning his flesh. His stoic response, repeating only, "I am a Christian," throughout the ordeal, so unnerved his torturers that they eventually resorted to beheading him instead. The gradual nature of this torture reflected Roman beliefs about certain crimes, requiring extended suffering for proper atonement. As the Stoic philosopher Seneca noted in his essay On Anger, some punishments were designed not merely to end life, but to extract the maximum suffering. Some punishments are designed to satisfy anger rather than justice, though these two should never be separated. Scaphism represented this principle taken to horrific extremes, a punishment so terrible that its mere existence served as a deterrent, rarely needing to be implemented. The Roman military writer Vegetius recorded that merely describing scaphism was often sufficient to extract confessions from spies and deserters, making the threat almost as effective as the punishment itself. In 270 CE, when Emperor Aurelian captured Queen Zenobia of Palmyra after her rebellion, he threatened her with scaphism. The normally defiant queen immediately submitted to Roman authority, choosing to live in comfortable Roman exile rather than face such a fate. Fire has always held dual symbolism as both purifier and destroyer, and Romans employed this duality in their torture method known as mors per lentum ignem, death by slow fire. Unlike simple burning at the stake, which could be mercifully quick if properly conducted, this punishment deliberately prolonged the victim's suffering through careful temperature control. The condemned might be placed in a bronze bull, adopted from the Greeks' brazen bull, suspended over low flames, gradually roasted on a metal grid called a creticula, or partially immersed in boiling oil. The Roman playwright Plautus referenced this punishment in his comedy The Prisoners, where a character threatens a cook with being roasted more slowly than a duck in a cold oven, demonstrating how these tortures permeated even Roman humor. In the Roman colony of Lugdunum, modern Lyon, France, in 177 CE, the Christian martyr Blandina was roasted on an iron chair over carefully controlled flames as part of public games, with witnesses recording that she remained conscious and speaking throughout much of the ordeal. For the Romans, fire punishments carried religious significance beyond mere retribution. The Vestal virgins tended Rome's sacred flame, and fire itself was associated with the hearth goddess Vesta and the forge god Vulcan. Using fire as punishment created a symmetry between the crime and consequence, with purifying flames cleansing the pollution caused by the criminal's actions. However, as Rome moved from republic to empire, what had been solemn religious ritual increasingly transformed into public spectacle, with executions by fire sometimes staged with theatrical elements to entertain the crowds while delivering justice. The jurist Ulpian, writing in the early 3rd century CE, classified death by fire as summum supplicium, the ultimate punishment, and recommended it particularly for arsonists, poisoners, and practitioners of magic. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a self-proclaimed prophet named Alexander, who had incited a riot, was burned alive in the Roman Forum, using a specialized metal seat that was gradually heated until it glowed red, allowing spectators to observe each moment of his suffering. Perhaps most psychologically terrifying was the Collegium Tenebrarum, literally the College of Shadows, the Roman practice of live burial. While most commonly associated with Vestal virgins who broke their vows of chastity, this punishment occasionally extended to those guilty of high treason or religious offenses. For the Vestals, the procedure was elaborate and deeply symbolic. The condemned priestess would be dressed in funeral attire, transported in a covered litter to the Campus Sceleratus, field of transgression, near the Colline Gate, and placed in a small underground chamber provisioned with minimal food, water, a lamp, and a bed. The provisions served an important legal and religious function. Technically, the Romans were not executing the Vestal, but creating conditions where she would die naturally, thereby avoiding the divine pollution that would come from directly harming a consecrated priestess. Archaeological excavations near the Colline Gate have uncovered small chambers consistent with historical descriptions of these burial sites, some containing the remains of what appear to be female skeletons alongside oil lamps and deteriorated food vessels. Once sealed in this chamber, the Vestal was technically not executed at all. She was simply abandoned underground, left to decide between ending her own life quickly or enduring a slow death by starvation. This legal fiction preserved the sacred prohibition against directly harming a Vestal while ensuring her punishment. The most famous victim was the chief Vestal Cornelia, condemned by Emperor Domitian in 91 AD despite her protestations of innocence. As she was led to her living tomb, Plutarch records that she maintained perfect dignity, even when her dress caught on the ladder leading down to the chamber. When the executioner offered his hand, she recoiled and drew back her body as if from pollution, preserving her purity even in her final moments. Pliny the Younger, who witnessed her procession to burial, wrote, "No proof of her guilt was offered beyond the emperor's assertion. She continued to call upon Vesta and the other gods, saying nothing more frequently during her journey to execution than 'Caesar thinks I am unchaste, I who have performed sacred rites while he triumphed and ruled.'" The psychological dimension of live burial made it particularly terrifying. Other execution methods, however painful, eventually ended. Buried alive, the condemned faced a uniquely existential horror. Trapped in darkness, knowing escape was impossible, forced to contemplate mortality as oxygen slowly diminished. The Roman philosopher Lucretius recognized this primal fear in his work On the Nature of Things, noting that the deep darkness of death represented humanity's most fundamental terror, a fear the collegium tenebrarum weaponized as punishment. This punishment was occasionally applied to others beyond the Vestals. After the failed conspiracy of Lucius Sergius Catilina in 63 BC, several conspirators were strangled in the Tullianum prison, but others were reportedly buried alive in specially constructed chambers beneath the floor of the prison itself. According to Sallust, these chambers were called tulliola, little Tullianums, and contained just enough space for a standing man, a particularly cruel variant that didn't even allow the victim to lie down while awaiting death. As we come to the end of our journey through Rome's darkest punishments, we've witnessed how power and fear shaped a justice system whose echoes still resonate today. As Seneca the Younger once observed, he who has made the infliction of punishment his trade strives to find pleasure not in having punished, but in punishing. Perhaps in this reflection lies Rome's darkest truth, that these elaborate penalties served purposes beyond justice. Whether you walk the ancient stones of the Forum or study the gaps in inscriptions where condemned names once stood, remember that in these punishments we glimpse not just Roman cruelty, but the eternal human struggle with power, justice, and memory. Until next time, farewell.